All right, so Judea under Roman rule. If y'all remember Wednesday night, we finished with that map. Well, we didn't finish with that map, but we may have finished with that map. We're starting with that map. How about that this morning? This map shows the extent of Roman rule, understanding that it's not the extent during the first century because some of these territories are going to be added a little bit later on. But I would just point out one thing on the map, that if you look over here, that little green area right there, Jerusalem, that's Judea, obviously. And some of these areas were not necessarily under Roman control during the first century, but Judea, being where it was during the first century, was pretty much very close to the border areas of the Roman Empire. That made Judea very important. Egypt was important because of the food supply. Judea was important because it was kind of on the borders. And I might just point out that there are some people living out here, and they controlled part of this territory for part of their history as well. We know them in the Old Testament as the Persians. By the time you get to later history, they're called the Parthians. These people were very problematic for the Roman Empire. And so anything that would have been in this area when they're over here would have been an area that Rome would have been very interested in keeping under control. And so what ends up happening is they're going to be very interested in what goes on in Judea. They don't want rebellion anywhere, but you really don't want rebellion in a territory that's immediately occupied by some people that are not very friendly to you. And so what happens in Judea is going to be very important for the Romans. And so Judea is going to be a problematic province. They're going to lead a couple of really big rebellions or revolts against Roman rule. Plus, there's going to be some other little ones that happen over the decades as well. So let's get into this and get into the class. Talk a little bit about how they came under Roman rule. 63 BC is a date you've already seen because we've already talked about it. Pompey, who is a Roman, intervenes in the struggle between Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II. If you think about Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, who are these people? What dynasty did they come from? Nope. They're the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans as we know them once they actually become a dynasty. So Aristobulus and Hyrcanus are Hasmoneans, the same as the Maccabees. Remember, Maccabees is what you call them when they're rebelling. Hasmoneans is what you call them when they establish a dynasty. So Pompey, or Rome, if you will, intervenes in that struggle between these two men. Jerusalem is besieged, and then Jerusalem falls. And 12,000 Jews are killed when Jerusalem falls. That's 63 BC. As a result of that, Judea is going to be incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. Syria we usually think of as being up north, but remember Roman provinces don't follow national boundaries. So you've got the Roman province of Syria. This area of Judea gets incorporated into that province. Okay, borders will shift back and forth across the Roman Empire. We don't need to worry too much about that. Hyrcanus is named ethnarch. Ethnarch is a term that simply means leader of the people. Okay, he's named ethnarch of Judea. He does not get the title king. Okay. He is confirmed as well as high priest, but he's answerable to the Roman governor. So the Romans are going to rule the area. They make Hyrcanus a leader in name, and they make him the high priest. But he's not independent because he's going to have to answer to the Romans. In other words, they're calling the shots. The territory then included places that we are somewhat familiar with, at least a couple of these we are. Judea and Galilee, we know those from the New Testament. We talk about them all the time. Idumea, which is another area that we've talked about in this class. Idumea is to the south of Judea. Who lives in Idumea? That's not a trick question. The Idumeans live in Idumea, and these are the descendants of Old Testament Edomites. Okay, so that's who they are. And then we have Perea as well. We'll see a map in a little while and you kind of get an idea where these areas are. Other areas are lost to the Hasmonean dynasty. So, for example, Samaria is lost. They get that territory taken away. It's kind of interesting, and you'll see this on a map, that you've got, and it's the next slide, you've got Galilee up in the north, you've got Judea in the south, you've got Samaria in between the two. So you would think that if you're going to rule that area, you would put all of that area under one ruler, right? Wouldn't that be logical to us? It's logical to us because we don't rule an empire. If you rule an empire, you know that you've got to keep these people kind of broken up and on their toes a little bit. And so it throws them off balance. So Samaria is lost to the Hasmoneans. Hyrcanus, remember, is a Hasmonean. He still keeps some areas that had been a part of their dynasty. Okay, so there's the map that I promised you. Cynthia, go ahead and ask your question.
Did they respect the high priest needing to be a Levite and all that kind of stuff?
Romans didn't care. Just like they didn't care who's selling the office to the highest bidder. Okay, and that a high priest was supposed to serve for life. You get that in the New Testament. When we talk about Annas being the high priest and Caiaphas is the high priest. So who's the high priest? Well, they both are. Because Caiaphas is actually in office, but Annas was the one who had been high priest, and you're supposed to be high priest for life. The Romans don't care, okay? They're gonna do what makes sense to them.
What do you do if you're a faithful Jew and this is the situation? What are you supposed to do?
The best you can. Until it becomes intolerable, and then you join a rebellion. Okay? You just do the best you can, because you know that the high priest is not really serving legitimately, but there are a lot of things that aren't happening legitimately by the time you get into this period. They're not happening the way they should have happened had you had a Davidic king, had you had the correct priesthood and high priest.
Try to please God, but I'm kind of...
The best you can. You don't have control over who's the high priest, but you do have control over what you're doing. It's a lot. I mean, we don't have a high priest today in America as a political office, but it's kind of like Christians today. I mean, Christians, we don't live under a Christian government. And so Christians just have to live the best they can under whatever government we live under. And admittedly, for American Christians, it's actually pretty easy to live under that government. There are a lot of other Christians in the world that have to wrestle with some other questions that we don't really have to wrestle with here. So... all right, so that's the map. Those are the areas. This is Judea. This is Idumea. Okay, my boxes just kind of give you a general idea. Samaria is up here. Perea is over here. And this area over here, I think, is Perea as well. Galilee is up in the north. Okay, so this would have been the Hasmonean kingdom would have incorporated all of that. But what's left to Hyrcanus is this area of Perea, Judea, Idumea, and Galilee with Samaria, with all of that territory kind of stuck in the middle. What it does is it fragments your political power. And so it means that we're leaving a Hasmonean on the throne, but after all, well, we're leaving as high priest. We're going to give him the title ethnarch. But if you're a Hasmonean, you're looking at this and you're saying, well, my family's been in control of things for a while, right? We kicked the Seleucids out. We established a kingdom. And so you have a tendency to not like being under the rule of someone else. So by fragmenting the area under his rule, that allows politically for the Romans to maintain control. Okay, think about it, what it would be like. Let's say tomorrow Mexico decided they wanted all of the territories that they lost in the Mexican War, they wanted all that back. And let's say they were successful in doing that. Well, there's a whole lot of people living in Texas and California and Arizona and New Mexico who are used to being American citizens. And now all of a sudden we're responsible to another government with another set of laws. How well would that go over with a lot of people in the Southwest? Probably not very well at all. Would it take Mexico a while to solidify their control over these territories? Sure it would, okay? And that's what you've got going on there. You've got the Romans are trying to exercise control over the area. We have to deal with a regime that was there in the past. How do we keep them so that the people are somewhat happy, but at the same time not allow them to have too much power? They accomplish that by fragmenting the kingdom up. All right, let's go ahead and pull up the next slide then, continue talking about this. The Romans are going to rule the area through a series of puppet rulers. The first are the Hasmoneans. We already saw that, 63 BC. Then they're going to use the Herods. We're going to have an entire class on the Herods because that's a whole family, okay? We think about Herod the Great, but there are other Herods as well. Herod the Great is not the Herod that actually puts Jesus on trial. That's a different Herod. So we'll talk about that as an entire class. Then we have the Roman governors. They play an important role as well. So if you look, fast forward a little bit in time, you get to the New Testament. Jesus is going to be on trial before Herod, and I'll just give you a freebie, that's Herod Antipas. Come to the lecture in April and we'll talk about him. But also before Pontius Pilate. Pilate is what? He's the Roman governor, okay? So both are involved in all of this. They play an important role. Boundaries are going to shift over time. So if you look at that map that I gave you and you say, well, I looked in a book and my boundaries were different, that's okay, because boundaries are going to shift back and forth over time, all right? You should not get too worked up out of shape or warped out of shape over boundaries that shift in the ancient world, because they shifted quite a bit. Jewish rulers, or Jewish areas I should say, are going to be ruled at times by descendants of Herod the Great in the New Testament period, okay? And at other times by Roman governors. So you have a listing of the Roman governors who were there, who were in control, but you've also got some local rulers, some descendants of Herod that are being used as well. And it gets really, really complex as you get into the New Testament period. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while here in the class. All right, next slide. We have a series of rebellions, and these are beyond the ones that we usually think about. So in 57 BC, there's a rebellion that's led by Alexander, who is the son of Aristobulus. Okay, Aristobulus II is of what dynasty? He's a Hasmonean, okay? So the house of the Hasmoneans, at least part of them, are leading a rebellion. The result of that is that Hyrcanus II loses all political authority, okay? So the Romans look at that situation, they say these Hasmoneans are pesky. I know Aristobulus II is not the same as Hyrcanus II, but because of what Aristobulus II does, Hyrcanus II ends up losing his political authority. In 56 BC, then Aristobulus II himself, remember the first one is by Alexander, his son. In 56 BC, another one is led, this time by Aristobulus II, okay? In 55 BC, Alexander, that's the son, leads another revolt. He's defeated near Mount Tabor, okay? In 53 BC, then a fellow whose name was Pithilaus leads an unsuccessful revolt after the death of the Roman governor in battle against the Parthians. Remember the Parthians? Those are the people we're calling Persians, or where those are the Persians that are now going under the name Parthian. It's the same part of the world, okay? That are pretty virulent enemies against the Roman Empire. They've got their own empire, and they don't like these Romans exerting their power in their direction. So in 53 BC, Pithilaus says, what? The Roman governor's dead. So this would be a good time to lead a rebellion, okay? It's unsuccessful, he's killed, and his followers are sold into slavery, okay? 57, 56, 55, 53. Those are very close succession that you have these rebellions against Roman rule. See why the Romans would take this area pretty seriously? They're expanding their empire. And when you expand into this area and the people don't like it a whole lot, you're going to have to deal with that. And so the Romans will deal with these rebellions. This period is also, and this also helps the Jews a little bit, even though they're not successful, it's a period of civil war and unrest in the Roman Empire, and that makes life precarious in Palestine, because you never know what's going to happen next. If you think about your Roman history, this is the period that's going to eventually give rise to the Roman Empire, okay? As there's civil war, civil unrest. When a republic has a lot of fragmentation caused by civil war and civil strife, what might be the solution to that? Find someone who's a really strong leader who might set laws aside and rule with an iron fist. So, for example, you have that in the Roman period. When all of that's said and done, who's going to end up being the emperor? Augustus, okay? He will rule very firmly and institute a period of peace. Think about Germany after World War I. They established what's called the Weimar Republic. It's a democratic country. But a lot of Germans don't like that, and they don't like the unrest. And so they find a fella who, through unrest, manages to establish a strong-arm government. What was that fellow's name? Adolf Hitler. Okay, this happens a lot when a republic is weak, that then it opens the door for some kind of a strong man to take over and, well, establish a new kind of government. So you have a period of civil war in the Roman Empire. It makes life precarious for Jews in Palestine. I'm going to say that wrong every time this morning. But it also opens the door for these rebellions, okay? Quite a few people in Jewish areas were unhappy living under Roman rule because of what we've talked about. They're interfering with what Jews would have rightfully considered their internal affairs. Who's going to be high priest and how all that's going to work. The Romans are sticking their fingers in, and they don't care anything about they don't care anything about the Jewish law. And so a lot of Jews are unhappy with that. Once Augustus, when all the dust settles in the Roman Empire, once Augustus becomes emperor, the situation is going to calm down considerably. It's going to calm down a lot, okay? Because Augustus institutes a period that is called the Pax Romana, which simply means the Roman peace. And indeed, that's going to be a period that's going to last a good while into the first century, and it's going to be very good for a lot of people living in the Roman Empire. It's going to be really good for some other people that are going to come along later, the Christians. Because in the Roman peace, you've got good roads. Generally speaking, you could travel pretty safely. You could travel by sea pretty safely because the Mediterranean was completely controlled by the Romans. And so what it meant for Christians was the message of Jesus Christ could be taken everywhere in the Roman Empire. And except for the fact that the Roman government sometimes persecuted Christians, it was actually not a bad period of time, okay, for the spread of the gospel. Remember, Jesus is sent, God sends his Son when the fullness of time has come. And I think a part of that was establishing this empire and getting things very peaceful so that the gospel could spread under those circumstances. There were some later rebellions that we'll just mention here. One of those was in 6 AD, led by a man whose name to us is just Judas of Galilee. I don't know who his dad's name was, but we know him in history as Judas of Galilee. So he leads a rebellion. Who's living in Galilee in 6 AD? Jesus would have been. His family would have been. Jesus would have been probably around the age of 10 or 11. So he would have remembered this rebellion. It doesn't mean that they took part in it. It doesn't mean his family took part in it. What I mean by that is this would have been something that people were aware of. Another rebellion is led by a fellow whose name was Theudas, and he leads his rebellion in about 44 to 46. Is that before or after the time of Jesus? It's after the time of Jesus, okay? Neither one of those rebellions are successful. There's going to be some later. As a matter of fact, it's our very next slide, which is going to be considerably different than those earlier two. The first, what's called a Jewish-Roman war, it goes by a couple of different names in history, lasts from 66 to 74 AD. The causes of this war, there were several of them. One of those was that there were tensions between the Jews and the Greeks over religious issues. What's happened, and I should have just pulled up another map there, what's happened is you've got a lot of Greeks that have moved into these areas, especially north of Galilee, but even in Galilee. And these people are living in very close proximity to each other, but they have very different outlooks towards things, okay? And so you've got Jews that are wanting to follow the Jewish law, and you've got some neighbors over there that are eating pigs and committing fornication and doing other things that are offensive to Jewish sensibilities. And so there's going to be some religious tensions between these two groups in Palestine. See, I said it right that time. I had to make myself say it right, okay? So that's one of the factors of this first revolt or first war, if you will. Another one is dissatisfaction with Roman rule. Roman governors were not always really nice people, and they really didn't care sometimes about Jewish sensibilities, and they ruled with an iron fist. So we have Pontius Pilate. We see his interaction with Jesus, but he interacted with the Jews on other occasions, and it was not usually a good interaction. As a matter of fact, one of those gets mentioned in the Gospels, okay, that Pontius Pilate had slaughtered some people, all right, or had ordered their slaughter, all right? So you've got Roman rule is oppressive if you're a Jew, and it's offensive if you're a Jew. And when you have that going over and over and over, it doesn't get better. They don't all become good model Roman citizens. It would be like my example earlier. If Mexico takes all of the southwestern United States back, there would be some people that would acclimate very well to that, and they would do just fine living under Mexican rule. There'd be a whole lot of other folks that wouldn't do very well with that, and they might do what? They might rebel, and they might lead some rebellions. And so I would think that if Mexico really wants the Southwest back, they need to count on the fact that it's going to take them probably a century or more to really calm things down. That's what you've got going on in Judea and the other Jewish areas. Cynthia?
Okay, so up through the captivity, the Jews were notorious for constantly rebelling against God, turning away. Have we had some sort of renaissance with them to where they want to be faithful and are offended when things aren't the way God wanted to be suddenly? Because it really never bothered them before when the people around them weren't doing God's way. So where are they now?
You've got a renaissance of sorts with some, okay? They come back from the captivity, by and large, purged of some of their rebelliousness. Not entirely purged, because you see that even in the books of the Old Testament or post-captivity, that there's some things that have to be dealt with. In the intertestamental period, you've got Jews that are wanting very firmly to stay with the Jewish law. You've got other Jews that are acclimating by adopting Greek customs, which read into that Greek customs that are contrary to Jewish law. All right? So there's always this tension in the Jewish nation from that time forward, where you've got those that want to do what's right, those that are wanting to, those that have learned their lesson, and those that simply want to get along, okay, and do whatever it takes to get along with whoever the government is and whoever your neighbors are. That's going to come up over and over. It comes up in the intertestamental period. It comes up in the first century as well. After all, in the first century, who's controlling the temple? What religious group? The Sadducees are in control of the temple. But what's up with the Sadducees? Who are these people? They're a religious sect that, to a certain extent, had adopted Greek thought and Greek culture. And so they're in control of the temple. They don't believe in what? We know this from the New Testament. What do they not believe in? No resurrection, no angels, no spirit. And so Jesus interacts with those people. By the way, who were the opposite pole of the Sadducees? The Pharisees. Okay, where did the Pharisees exercise their control by and large? In the synagogues. Okay, so you got the temple in Jerusalem controlled by people that have adopted certain ways of Greek thinking. You've got the Pharisees that are in control of the synagogues that have not adapted quite to the same extent. Greek culture, not religion, but Greek culture has affected almost everybody. So, for example, you have this fella who is from Tarsus. He's a Roman citizen. He is a Pharisee. What do we know him by? What's his name? Paul or Saul. So what's the difference between Saul and Paul? No, it's not because somebody switched a P for an S. Saul is a very Jewish name. Paul it's not a Jewish name, okay? So he's adopted a couple of names. He uses one that's Jewish. He uses one that's Gentile. And a lot of people did that, okay? A lot of people did that in the first century. So in Peter's case, for example, Peter has adopted he's got a Jewish name, and he ends up getting an Aramaic name / Greek name. But is Peter Greek in his thinking? By and large, not. Is Paul, Greek in his thinking? Somewhat, okay? But he's still very much a Jew. He's still very much a Pharisee. So it's a mixing. An example that I would give, my lovely wife is sitting over there. Is she Czech or American? She's both. There's some things about her that are still very much Czech. And you run into those every once in a while. And there are some things about her that are very much American. When I lived in the Czech Republic, was I Czech or American? I was both, okay? The longer I lived there were some things where my thinking changed. And sometimes you will run into that a little bit with me. I've learned to keep some of that to myself, all right? But when you live in two cultures, you adopt a little bit of both. And so Jews are living, at this point in time by the New Testament period, they've been living under Greek cultural influence for 2 centuries. And so it's affected some of their thinking. But there would be some who would be very much towards the Greek end and others who would be very much towards the Jewish end. And so you have that tension going on there with those folks. By the way, when you get to we're talking about the Jewish revolt here, what ends up happening in the city of Jerusalem while the Romans are besieging the city, you've got a civil war going on inside the city between these factions. That isn't helpful to anybody, right? So it's very complicated. It's complex and messy, yes. All right, so the other cause of all of this is the prophecies of Matthew 23 and 24. Jesus says it's going to happen, and it does, okay? So you have the causes from a worldly standpoint, but then you have what Jesus says is the cause. What is Jesus' statement of the cause of this? They've done what? The Jewish nation has done what? They've rejected the Messiah, okay? They've rejected the Messiah, and they've rejected the ones that the Messiah sends, okay? Because of that, then, God's judgment is going to come into play. So we see the worldly reasons, but what's going on behind the scenes is God is judging the Jewish nation, okay? So those are all causes for this first revolt. The Roman military garrison of Judea, as well as King Agrippa II, remember we're going to talk about the Herods later, are forced to flee. So when these people rebel, all of a sudden the Romans have to get out. They're not able to get any kind of control back at all. All right, next slide. The rebels then defeat a Roman force at Beth Horon. I want you to just notice the dates up there, 66 to 74. The city of Jerusalem will fall in 70. It will take the Romans 8 years to fully quash this rebellion, 4 years just to take Jerusalem back. And of course, Jerusalem is the goal. You want Jerusalem back because that's the capital city. Everybody wants to take capital cities. In 67 AD, the Romans under Vespasian, he's later going to be emperor, invade Galilee. Okay? In 69 AD, Vespasian is proclaimed emperor, except he's over here in Judea. So what's he got to do? He's got to hightail it back to Rome because I'm the emperor now. I've got to be in Rome, the capital city. So he leaves for Rome, but he's got a son whose name is Titus. He says, Titus, you take care of things over here for me. And Titus is going to lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. By the way, what's Titus later going to be? He's also going to be emperor later, okay? So 67, 69 AD, they begin to besiege the city of Jerusalem. In 70 AD, after a siege that lasted about 7 months, Jerusalem falls. The population itself had been devastated during the siege. A 7-month siege of any city is going to produce a lot of illness, a lot of famine in the city, okay? Beyond the fact that you've also got people fighting against each other inside the city, especially at the end, okay? Many inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem were crucified after trying to escape. Josephus says that there were so many that the Romans ran out of wood for the crosses. That's why I made the statement that if you go to Jerusalem today and some little tour guide says, look, an olive tree from the time of Jesus, don't you believe it, okay? Because those trees were all wiped out during the siege, okay? It might be the son or the grandson of a tree that was there during the time of Jesus. It might be very old, but it does not date to the time of Jesus. Not if it's around Jerusalem, all right? Not saying for Galilee or anywhere else, but around Jerusalem the trees are wiped out because we're just crucifying everybody we can catch, okay? And we need lots of wood for that. So many are crucified after trying to escape. Thousands that are still alive in the city die when the Romans enter the city. The survivors were mostly sold into slavery. By the way, if you go to Rome, you might happen to visit this big arena there called the Colosseum. I think everybody who goes to Rome sees the Colosseum. You probably should see the Colosseum if you go to Rome. It was built with Jewish slave labor, okay? Slaves were brought back to Rome, and they were put to work. And they were put to work building the Colosseum, and probably some finances as well from money that was taken from the city. The temple was burned, and the city was destroyed. Now, supposedly, Titus didn't want that to happen. Titus didn't want the temple to be destroyed, but somebody started a fire, okay? And as it started burning, supposedly, if we're to believe the accounts, the gold inside the temple, and there was a lot of it, who built the temple that's there when the Romans destroyed the city? Herod. And he was the kind of guy that really made things opulent. Supposedly, the gold started to melt, and it runs between the cracks of the bricks, the stones of the temple. Well, now if you're an enterprising Roman soldier, you want to supplement your pay. So what do? You get that gold. So you start tearing stones apart to get that gold out. Again, if this is to be believed, history is sometimes full of anecdotes that are not particularly true. This one sounds good, so I'm giving it to you with my caveat. And so literally the Roman soldiers tore the temple apart stone by stone, fulfilling Jesus' prophecies in Matthew chapter 23 and 24 that no stone of the temple would be left standing. And in fact, no stone of the temple is left standing today. Well, wait a minute. We've seen pictures in Jerusalem of all these Jews praying in front of what's called the Wailing Wall. And our trusty Newsweek, are they even still in existence? Time Magazine, CNN, Fox News, whoever has said that's the last remaining part of the temple. No, it's not. Be careful what you listen to. It may not be true. That's the foundation that Herod built to extend the Temple Mount because he wanted a bigger temple than Solomon had built, so he needed a bigger mountain because you can't move it to another mountain, so we make the mountain bigger. And so today, if you go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, those stones are what's left of the retaining wall that Herod built. The temple itself is gone. There's nothing left of it. Okay? So the temple's burned, city's destroyed, but the war isn't over yet because there's still some Jewish rebels out there that we've got to deal with. So from 70 to 74 AD, the Romans are going to deal with all of those strongholds. And one of those is Masada. Another one is Herodium. Who do you think built Herodium? Herod, hence the name, okay? We're going to talk about Herod. He was a prolific builder. He built a lot of stuff, okay? So in the spring of 74 AD, Masada, which is the last fortress, it's located down by the Dead Sea, falls to the Roman soldiers. They made a movie about this years ago. I don't even think you can find it anymore online or wherever, about this Jewish revolt. Supposedly, again, based on Josephus and probably some other historical resources, the people inside Masada ended up committing mass suicide once they knew the walls were going to be breached. So the men all went home and slaughtered their wives and children. And then the men drew lots, and the ones that drew the lots got to kill the other men until there were a couple left and they were supposed to commit suicide. It's kind of a Jonestown type thing. All right? For those of you that are old enough to remember what Jonestown was. So mass suicide, mass murder. They didn't all do that. They actually, I think, found about 7, maybe a handful of survivors survived Masada. Why in the world would these Jewish men go home and slaughter their wives and children? Because Roman slavery was awful. Okay, that's exactly right. If you were a female slave, you were at the whim, the beck and call of your master for anything he wanted. Now, let your mind run with that, and you will understand exactly why a husband would not want his wife sold into slavery. And oh, by the way, Romans were pedophiles as well. So young children, the same fate awaited them. So these men decided it would be better to make sure their wives and children didn't fall into Roman hands. When the Romans entered Masada, there were stores of grain, there were stores of food still available. They did not starve the people out. They simply were able to breach the walls and get into the city, and the Jews were all dead, except for that handful by the time they got there. Remember that. We sometimes talk about slavery in the Roman world. It was very common, and it was, what was your word again? Awful, okay? It was awful to be a slave, all right? Men were not exempt from that because there was a whole lot of not only pedophilia in the Roman Empire, there was a lot of homosexuality as well. And so slaves were at the beck and call. They were owned by their owners. Make no mistake, slavery in America was that way too. And all you have to do is look at the descendants of Thomas Jefferson to know that it was. Because he's got a lot of black descendants as well from him and his slaves. So slavery is an awful thing regardless of where we find it. Okay, off my soapbox for a minute. Let's show some pictures. This is from a place called Gamla. It's in Galilee. It was called Masada of the North. It fell during its second siege, which is about 67 AD. And in the foreground there, you have a reconstruction of a Roman siege weapon. We sometimes think all these guys had were swords and shields. They didn't. That is a weapon that shoots a very large arrow. An arrow that could easily go through several people on its way to getting to its end destination. So if you're fighting against mass troops, that would be an impressive weapon to use. I don't remember the name of that, what those were called. Next photograph is Masada. Aaron, you've been there, haven't you? Okay. So I don't know why I'm not getting all of my little... Oh, they're up there now. Okay. So Masada is up on top of that hill. There are the remains and reconstructions of a siege wall built around the fortress of Masada. Why would you build a siege wall? So no one can escape, exactly. Because if these guys get out and go somewhere else, we're just going to have to go, it's going to be like whack-a-mole, all right? We know the game, whack-a-mole, all right. So you build a wall around it so they can't get out. You've got a camp up here because the Romans are going to be there for a while. You got another camp down here, another camp down here, and they are going to build a siege ramp. That's how you get up to the walls of the fortress. So the Romans build a siege ramp, and you can go to Masada today and still see it. It's still there, what's left of it, so that they can get their battering rams and things up to the walls. And once they get up to the walls, the days are numbered. Okay, they're going to pound through that wall, and once they get through, they're going to pour troops in. Remember, the Romans are tenacious. They don't give up. And they are not going to let these folks survive, okay? If they had captured any of them, and they did capture a handful, they're sold into slavery, okay? The men are killed. The women and children are sold into slavery. All right, so another photograph. This is what's called the Judea Capta coin. It's minted by Vespasian. And if you will look over here, that's Vespasian. But if you'll look over here, we've got a palm tree. A palm tree was a symbol in the ancient world of Judea. And here you've got, here you've got a Roman, and you've got Judea over here. She's the woman, and she's got her head down because she is mourning because she's now been captured. By the way, if you collect coins from this era, you might try to find one of those. They're kind of pricey. We don't have a mic person today. How is that possible? Holler loud, Rusty. It was. The fortress was built by Herod, okay? Built up. I think there was already something there before Herod, but he builds it up. Okay. So they celebrate. When they capture Judea, they celebrate. You mint a coin. It's like if the mint today mints a commemorative coin, okay? There will undoubtedly be commemorative coins minted after the inauguration tomorrow because they probably do that after every inauguration of every new president. It's a big deal. Judea is subdued. It's a big deal for the Romans. All right, if you happen to be in Rome and you've seen the Colosseum, right? You might probably see this as well. I cannot imagine that you would go to Rome and not see this. This is the Arch of Titus. It was built by Domitian to celebrate Vespasian's and Titus's victory over Judea. So who is Domitian? Yeah, another member of this dynasty. And he's the guy that is persecuting Christians that lays the setting for the book of Revelation. Okay, so the Arch of Titus is there, and by the way, if you get to go see the Arch of Titus, make sure you look real closely at the decorations that are on the Arch of Titus. You will see things like the temple menorah being hauled off because they get those things out of the temple. All right, that was our first bell. We're going to keep going because I want to get to a logical stopping place. All right, so our next photograph, there's our detail. There you go. This is the treasure scene, so you have the temple menorah circled there on the left of the picture. You also have the table of showbread on the right side. That's a little bit harder to see, but the menorah is very easy to see. So if you look up close when you see that, that's what you will see. All right, so I thought I had more than that. Good. Benefits of Roman rule. That's where we're going to stop. We'll pick up right here Wednesday night. I don't want to be in the middle of that. We'll pick up right here Wednesday night and go down through the rest of that class. and then we'll move right into the next topic. Okay, that's not going to take us the whole time, so we'll go from there right into the next topic.